I'm Avery Davis Roberts, an Associate Director in the Carter Center's Democracy Program. Thank you for joining us. Earlier today, we recorded a fascinating and informative conversation between three leading U.S. election experts about what to expect during next month's election. I think you'll find it enlightening, but before I turn it over to them, I wanted to take a minute to tell you about the Carter Center's plans this year. As you may know, the Center has observed more than 110 elections in 39 countries, but we've never gotten involved in U.S. elections. One reason is that we typically prioritize work in places where democracy seems poised to take a step forward or where it's in danger of sliding backwards. These places are often struggling with polarization, a lack of public trust, ethnic or racial divisions, and fears that election results won't be credible or accepted. U.S. elections have never been perfect, but generally Americans trusted in the process and believed in the results. But in the last 5 or 10 years, we've started seeing many of the same discouraging trends we see in countries where we work. And so, after careful consideration, we decided to get involved. Limited time and resources mean we can't mount a full-scale observation mission, but something we've learned in our international work is that one way to encourage good elections is to increase public knowledge of electoral processes and to encourage election officials to make these processes as transparent as possible. We're working on a number of behind-the-scenes efforts, but we've also launched a public information campaign to help enhance public knowledge. By being with us tonight, you're all a part of that campaign. And if you stick around until the end of this conversation, you can be among the first in the country to see a 90-second animated video we've created that we'll be sharing all over social media in the next few days. We're excited about it, and we're working on others. Now let me turn things over to Suzanne Malveaux, a national correspondent on CNN, where she covers politics, national news, international events, and culture. She's a former White House correspondent who covered Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, and we are so grateful she's taken the time to be with us today. I'm going to hop into the Zoom live chat where my colleagues and I will answer as many of your questions as we can while the conversation proceeds. Suzanne, take it away.
Thank you, Avery. I'm happy to be a part of this important conversation in an unprecedented time in American history. The U.S. election is just 26 days away. We're 7 months into a global pandemic. More people are expected to vote by mail this year than in any past election. We're hearing predictions of long lines on election day because of a possible shortage of poll workers who tend to be older voters and therefore at more serious risk of COVID-19. On top of that, we also have confirmed reports of foreign disinformation campaigns designed to sow chaos and discord. We have accusations of vote rigging on one side, voter suppression on the other. One is based on very little evidence, the other chock full of examples. Many people on both sides see this election as one of the most important in decades. And many people of both political parties feel a sense of dread of what is to come. But I know that today's panelists do not believe that, that they do see some good in the news, that it is not all bad, and that this election process can be resilient, even in turbulent times. They are experts on election security, electoral processes, and I hope they can give us a better idea of what is happening behind the scenes, on, before, and after Election Day, so we are well informed, well prepared to make our voices heard. Well, these three panelists have incredible resumes, and it would take us the full hour if we went through all of them. So we're just going to give the briefest of introductions. I want to start off with Michael Chertoff. He worked under President George W. Bush as the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009. He later co-founded the Chertoff Group. He is an expert, among other things, on cybersecurity and disinformation. Welcome, Michael.
Good to be here.
Kevin Johnson is a senior member of the Carter Center's U.S. Election Expert Study Team and the founder and executive director of Election Reforms Network. He has 20 years experience in election reform programming in the United States and abroad. Kevin, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Jennifer Morell spent 9 years as an election official in Utah and Colorado. She is now a partner at the Elections Group, where she consults on election administration and auditing. She is a recognized expert in election audits. So thank you, Jenna, for joining us. We have an excellent panel today, and let's just jump in. So my first question, we'll be talking about solutions, but I want to set the stage here, if you will, in a quick round robin. What is the one thing that keeps you up at night? Michael, go.
I'm mostly concerned about the fact that it will take a while to count the votes and that there will be an effort on the part of the candidate to somehow claim that the count ought to stop because of the fact that it's, quote, rigged or stolen. And by the way, we don't have to worry about foreign disinformation. We are doing quite a good job domestically with disinformation. So getting the count done as quickly as possible, but properly, and not allowing bogus claims that somehow there's misconduct in the count, that strikes me as the thing I most am concerned about.
Kevin.
I'm actually feeling, relatively hopeful about our election officials and the way they're going to handle this. What I am worried about is just what you mentioned, that too many people in this country have existential dread about the results. We're not electing an emperor, we're electing a president. That person is constrained by law. People on the losing side are going to have their opportunity to continue to influence policy. We all need to be ready to accept the results.
Jennifer?
There's been this great campaign to really encourage voters to vote early, but what keeps me up at night is we really don't know. We've got this unprecedented change in how people are going to vote, when they're going to vote, by mail, in person, earlier on election day. And so anticipating where that demand is going to be and when, and making sure that election officials are prepared with the resources and people to meet that demand adequately is probably one of my biggest concerns right now.
So Michael, let's dive into those security concerns, because you write in an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, you outline so many problems that we are facing with this particular election. How is this one different than previous elections, and what do voters need to know about the kinds of disinformation campaigns and the state of security of our elections this year?
Well, so, there are obviously cybersecurity issues that arise. It's not the voting itself, because the machines tend to be not connected to the internet except extremely briefly. But there is a concern about, for example, registration databases being encrypted by bad actors so that you have ransomware and you basically can't check people's registration. The answer to that, which I hope many of the jurisdictions have done, is to have a backup system unconnected to the internet, even paper, so that if you have to manually check registration, you can do that. The other concern is violence, either at or intimidation, either at polling places or at locations of counting. There's a story today, the FBI just arrested 6 individuals who were threatening to kidnap Governor Whitmer of Michigan. There are some violent actors out there who have been inspired to believe they can interfere with what they view as a, quote, rigged, close quote, process. So again, there's going to have to be good coordination between the FBI and federal law enforcement and with local elected officials to have an assurance of security and no intimidation at polling places.
Are you satisfied, Michael, with what you are seeing and what you are learning about those type of people and authorities in place to make sure that there is not violence at the polls?
Well, I will say I'm mildly optimistic. I've gotten reports in various locations, particularly in places that I happen to know people, indicating that election officials are conscious of this. The local officials are working with the FBI on the issue of identifying dangerous individuals, and we saw that today. And also that parts of the Department of Homeland Security are working on the cybersecurity element. Chris Krebs and the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency have been cooperating with local authorities. But again, there's no time to waste. We're getting close, and everybody's got to be on their toes.
Kevin, you talk about in your op-ed in the Washington Post the fact that there needs to be transparency, that officials, election officials, government officials, those involved in the election have to educate the public and just let them know straight up what the problems are going to be and how to best prepare for them. So tell us what you've learned, what you see will be potential problems, and what voters need to do to make sure that their ballots are submitted and counted in this election.
I think in that regard, many officials are doing a really good job. I think there's a lot of information that's being presented. People are emphasizing the important message, which is that voters have to make a plan. There are more options this year. There are more logistics to those options. No one should wait to the last minute. People who plan to vote by mail should do so as quickly as possible. People should know when the in-person pre-election voting period is. People should check where their polling stations are because some of those have changed location. And I think secretaries of state and local officials have done a very good job. There are some particular best practices I want to highlight. Secretary of State LaRose in Ohio, for example, has announced that, just to the point of transparency, when he issues the results, he's going to indicate each round of results how many outstanding absentee ballots are still expected. That's the kind of thing that I think can counter the narrative that the results on election night are definitive. No, there may still be some results coming in. So I think state officials are really recognizing the value of that dialogue and that openness with the population.
And Kevin, we know that voting has already started in many states. What are the kinds of things, are there any issues that you're already seeing in terms of some disputes or some challenges?
There have been some. There was an issue in Pennsylvania with some Republican poll watchers who wanted access to early voting. That's not allowed under Pennsylvania law. That's now being taken to court. But I think in general, the issues haven't been too bad. There's a piece today about Republican poll watchers setting up, lawn chairs outside of drop boxes. And the language of the article in some ways is encouraging because it's about people having a chance to find out for themselves if the law is being followed. And as long as that's what we're talking about, and as long as the disputes that are in the public domain are disputes anchored on law and actual evidence, then we're bringing this whole process back to where it should be, what's actually happened, not the kind of unsubstantiated claims that have been kind of really emphasized in the media and by political leaders, that are very distracting and very unsettling.
Jennifer, I want to go to you because you do something that is quite unique in the process that I think a lot of people in the public aren't even aware of. And that is after the election, you perform these audits. Can you tell me in layman's terms, what does that mean? What does that actually entail? How will you do that differently this year?
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. So most jurisdictions, most states around the country actually require what we think of as a traditional audit, a fixed percentage or fixed number of ballots that are hand counted and compared to the way the voting system interpreted those. And in most of those jurisdictions, that'll continue after Election Day. There are also a handful of states that are pioneering or have adopted something called a risk limiting audit. That's really been the endeavor I've focused on, helping to train and sort of teach what that looks like. What's unique about that, and where I think there's promise as we look to the future, is not only are we sampling all of the ballots. So in a fixed percentage audit, we might only take 2% of the total ballots cast or 2% of a particular precinct. In a risk limiting audit, we're going to do a universal sampling from all of the ballots. And the sample size will be driven by the margins, and that's important because the tighter the margins, the more ballots we want to review for evidence that the outcome is correct. The wider the margins, the more efficient we can make that audit by looking at fewer. The key to all of this is those ballots require human examination or human review to ensure that the voting equipment operated the way it was intended to, that it was able to tally and count those ballots, and ultimately that the correct winner won. In addition to that, that sort of peak or validation of the voting system, there are jurisdictions that also do a number of things around procedural audits. So that's looking at those chain of custody documents, ensuring reconciliation logs were completed correctly, meaning we don't have more ballots than there are voters, those sorts of things. And many of those practices or procedures, while they may not be called officially an audit, are required under state statute as part of the canvassing or certification process. So those are really important elements that come at the end of the election to provide that trust, to provide that validity, that things were conducted correctly.
And I'm glad you brought about the issue of trust and validity. There is a lot of mistrust and distrust right now among voters about our processes and about our institutions. And it's coming from the highest level, quite frankly. How do you counter that?
by really talking about the process and making sure that voters and candidates and other stakeholders understand when it comes to things like mail ballots, that there are actually layers of safeguards, layers of security that are really built into every jurisdiction's procedures. So thinking about how the voter is validated, how the ballot itself is validated, and I'd be happy to go into those, but I think really helping people understand this isn't just something we do on a whim, but all of the procedures for in-person, for voting by mail, have a series of safeguards to keep the integrity of that election.
I want to direct this to Michael, but everybody can jump into this one, because the big question for a lot of people is, are we going to have the election results the day after the election, or is this going to drag out potentially for weeks and even months? And Michael, I covered the re-election of George W. Bush in Florida, where they were counting the recount with the hanging chads and all of that, all of the drama around that. And of course, the question becomes is when are we going to know the results, and what are the type of things that you're actually seeing right now that could give us a hint in terms of what that timetable looks like?
Well, I'd be very surprised if we got definitive results the day of the election or even the day after. First of all, it's not at all unprecedented to have circumstances where there's a delayed count in an election or there's a recount. The important thing is to make sure you manage your expectations. It's not going to be like in those elections where 10 minutes after the polls close, a winner is able to be declared. And so it's important here, I want to put something on the media. It's important for the media to educate people and to carry on election day in a way that doesn't suggest there is a result. I mean, you may want to talk about how many people are at the polls or whether the lines are wrong, but the message has to be over and over. There are ballots coming in being counted, both from absentee ballots and mail to drop box ballots to people who are actually queued up at polling places. And that managing expectations is, I think, very, very important in this election.
Well, Kevin, I want to ask you, I mean, from the Carter Center's point of view, it's encouraging that you're involved, and also alarming the fact that there's a need to be involved in this election. And the history of the Carter Center is that you go into countries where there are weak democracies, where there is racial strife, where there is not a sense of trust in the outcome of the election. What does this say about the state of our country right now that the Carter Center is involved in the first place? What are we dealing with here?
You know, the Carter Center has, played some role from time to time in the U.S. And they've done some projects, for example, related to Native American voting rights and that kind of thing. So they haven't been completely absent, but you're right. This is a step forward for the Carter Center getting more deeply involved. And it does reflect the high stakes, and it does reflect kind of the intensity of the moment that we've talked about. I think the Carter Center will likely stay involved, longer in U.S. democracy, and their voice will be really valued. I had the privilege of seeing President Carter and Carter Center staff overseas do election monitoring work, and the reception to that man and what he stands for, and the way that carries forward the symbolism of what we've created through a system built on the will of the people, and how many other countries have really tried to rally to that example, I think is really quite remarkable.
So what were you looking for?
Well, I was also just wanting to touch base very quickly, Suzanne, if you don't mind, on the question of will there be a delay? Because I actually think there's a clarification that we should also point out. There's a bit of a sort of a theme or a narrative in the media right now that it's all going to be red votes counted first because Republicans are more likely to vote in person, and then the blue votes will all be counted later because Democratic voters are more likely to vote by absentee mail. Many of the states actually have processes that will allow them to begin working on the absentee ballots before Election Day. They can at least open them, verify them. In some states, they can count them. So it's not actually the case that we're going to have this. I think we have less to worry about than some people are thinking, that there's going to be sort of an initial result all based on one category of voters and then a subsequent vote that comes in later.
Jennifer, what's your feeling about the day after the election? And then I've got a follow-up about the absentee ballots.
Yeah, you bet. So I have the same optimism as my fellow panelists. I'm saying a lot of jurisdictions that are investing in technology to automate that process, that are getting these legislative changes so that they can process things sooner. I think it's important to point out, though, results have always been unofficial, right? On election night, we've never had official results, binding results, until the time that these jurisdictions certify. I think the other thing to keep in mind, too, as much as we're saying the work to sort of expedite the processing, whether it's running extra shifts or utilizing this technology, we still are going to see, I think, a number of provisional ballots as well this election due to state policy around if you've requested an absentee, but you show up to vote in person, and the impact that that's going to have. So that's going to add some time as well. Also, the states that are seeing this exponential growth in mail ballots, typically hand-marked paper ballots, we end up with things like ambiguous marks or adjudication decisions that have to be made, and that's going to prolong the process a little bit. So it's not all just election folks aren't running quick enough or fast enough, but just this shift is going to require this extra time.
And Jennifer, talk about Colorado. I know that you worked in Colorado for a number of years regarding the elections there. And it's one of the 9 states, and including the District of Columbia, that uses the universal mail-in ballots, where officials will mail those ballots to everyone before they actually request a ballot to make sure that everybody's got one. We've heard from, as recently as last night, the vice presidential debate, Mike Pence saying that it was a dangerous thing, and we've heard the White House express a great deal of concern about corruption and that this would be rigged if we had something like this that occurs in Colorado and some of these other states. Speak to that, if you will, and talk to voters about what does that mean? What is happening in Colorado? Is that working?
It is working, and it's working remarkably well. And I still feel like they're a model. Most states turn to them for advice and help as they're moving in that direction. I think one of the things that is often forgotten is when you're running an election like that, where you're proactively mailing out ballots, having really tight, clean registration lists is critical. And there's both for an efficiency standpoint as well as a cost standpoint. You don't want that mail going where it shouldn't be or paying for it to just be returned undelivered. And so states like Colorado and others that are proactively mailing ballots are regularly, daily participating in programs such as the ERIC, such as the National Change of Address program, to constantly vet those lists to make sure that if a voter has moved, that they, reach out to them and encourage them to update their registration, but those voters will not be mailed a ballot proactively. So that list maintenance piece is really crucial to the integrity of what happens after that. In terms of serving voters, they love it because they've got both options, actually. They get the time to spend with their ballot that month leading up to election day. They don't have to worry about filling out an extra application. And for the election administrator, it actually saves them a tremendous amount of time. That's one of the biggest bottlenecks right now in jurisdictions across the country that require an application, is they are trying to keep up with those applications when the folks in Colorado are now moving on to the preparation for election day, making sure their ballot processing facilities are staffed and ready to go. So it really is a win, I think, for both the administrator as well as the voter.
Voters have actually been encouraged to go ahead and fill out these absentee ballots and to turn them in, mail them in, and then to go back to the polls on voting day and try to vote again to test the system here to see if that ballot counted. Any of you jump in and tell me what would that look like? What would happen if a significant number of voters did that this year?
I'll start. It'll clog up the system, first of all, because those voters will be provisional voters. They will have been marked in the poll books, in the e-poll books, and in the paper poll books as having already returned a mail ballot. And processing a provisional voter just takes longer. So off the bat, they're already going to slow down the lines. They're going to slow down the back-end processing of having to do that research and make the determination of what's happened. But maybe more importantly, it's illegal. And I've certainly been, while not many, I've had a couple of cases in my time running elections that we did turn over to the district attorney's office and they did prosecute. So
that is not something that people should necessarily be taking seriously. Go ahead, Kevin, you wanted to say?
Yeah, there have been a couple examples of this in Georgia where, from the recent primary in Georgia, and that was a situation where you had people getting trained at the very last minute around COVID to use a whole new set of systems. And there were a couple of voters who were able to say after they cast a vote, wow, they let me cast one as well as mailing one, and I wasn't asked, I wasn't given the provisional ballot as I should have been. And what's really important when these things happen is that, no election is going to be flawless. There are going to be problems. What matters is the scale of the problem. And particularly when we're talking about sort of the most important issue of who won and whether the results were valid, problems are in a sense not significant unless they affect the number of ballots that's greater than the margin of victory. So there will be, social media will be lit up on election night and days after with stories of, oh, I saw a ballot here or something happened there. The whole thing is falling apart. It's all relative to the margin of victory. And that's likely to be a decently large number of ballots. So we need to keep that perspective in mind.
I think that's a really important point because, you can always find the odd circumstance, even before this election, where there's some kind of a mess up. In fact, many years ago, I actually prosecuted a local official for actually harvesting absentee ballots at a home for people who were mentally impaired and basically filling out their ballots for them. But again, it didn't scale. We're talking about 20 people. So that in a presidential or statewide election, it's really hard to be able to put enough resource into manipulating the process to really skew it. And that's why I think, again, reassuring people and not allowing, odd anecdotes to give people a misimpression is a really critical thing the media can do.
And Michael, one of the things you did is you wrote an op-ed in the USA Today with three other former secretaries of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, Janet Napolitano, and Tom Ridge. And the title is "Our Election Systems Are Safe and Our Democracy is Strong." And that is a message I think that it's not getting through, it's not piercing through. And maybe that is because of the social media and the megaphones that are loud, that are saying otherwise. How do you get that message across? I mean, what gives you that confidence that the safeguards work, that all of this is still in play, institutionally working when there's so much distrust?
So I do think that for the reasons we've talked about, both the officials who are involved with managing the election process, the fact that scale is a really critical variable in this, and the fact that we've gone through difficult elections in the country before, lead me to believe that we do have a sound system. But it does require people to take the time and effort to vote. And one of the things I want to say in addition to that op-ed is, if you look around the world now, you look at Belarus, you look at Hong Kong, you look at Bangkok, there are people who are risking their lives to make sure that they have fair elections and to protest against dictators who are trying to manipulate the process in order to get reelected. And I think Americans need to be inspired by this. Just as we pulled together after 9/11 and against an external threat, we need to pull together against the erosion of confidence and trust, which does undermine our democratic institutions.
Kevin, I want to talk about the voter registration efforts that have been very robust. And we've seen Stacey Abrams, who founded the New Georgia Project after her failed run for governor in Georgia and some of the wrongdoing that had occurred there. How important is the voter registration effort on the front end when you do still have those problems on the back end, when you're talking about whether it's the machines that aren't working or the long lines or some of the other shenanigans that are going on?
Voter registration is crucial, and the efforts to get people to register are an important part of our civic fabric around these elections. I think it's also worth pointing out that states have moved to more systemic approaches, whether that's election day registration, which simplifies the process a lot, automatic voter registration, which means that whenever a citizen comes encounter with a state agency, not just the motor vehicle agency, but other agencies, they are automatically asked, do they want to register? That's now in 30 states, if I'm not, Jennifer may know the detail on that, but it's now become much more common. So one of the good things about those kinds of systems is they move us away from registration drives, which are volunteers in communities writing down pieces of paper and bringing them in. And that's always there's a potential for error. Those are volunteers. And sometimes those errors have been blown out of proportion. So we're getting better at a systemic approach to registration, which is of course what happens everywhere else. Every other democracy makes it the responsibility of the election officials to make sure everyone's registered. And that's ideally something we should get to in the long run.
And Jennifer, talk a bit about the voter fraud. I mean, we just heard from the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, just last week in Congress, where he was testifying, and he said, quote, "We have not seen historically any kind of coordinated national voter fraud effort in any major election, whether it's by mail or otherwise." Why is that narrative and that concern of voter fraud in our system so prevalent still?
Yeah, I think a lot of it does have to do with a lack of understanding, as I mentioned earlier, about these different safeguards that are in place that would make that very difficult, whether those are physical security safeguards just around the ballot itself, those verification measures that I mentioned, things like not just verifying the voter, which by the way includes verifying their identity, verifying the mail ballot that's returned, starting with the signature of the declaration that says under penalty of perjury, I'm attesting that this is my ballot. Many states go a step further and have some sort of verification of the signature itself, or require a witness or a notary or some identifying information to accommodate that ballot. So we verify the voter. As another measure in that sort of verification process, we verify the ballot itself. So when those ballots are created, they're created with essentially proprietary marks, timing marks, channel marks, QR codes, that sort of thing, that can only be read by the voting system of the jurisdiction that produced it. And if they're not, that ballot gets rejected and has to be reviewed by a human to determine why it's not reading correctly. And finally, we're seeing more and more jurisdictions actually utilize some of the technology from the US Postal Service as another means of verification or security. Jurisdictions are leveraging intelligent mail barcodes so that they can track that ballot from their facility to the voter and from the voter back to the election facility. And something as simple as the official election mail logo, which you don't just get to go out and create yourself. You have to work with a mail design analyst to get that. And so I think when we start to see those allegations of fraud, and folks that are sort of listening to that and being influenced by that, it's probably because they don't understand this whole process. And I think what's really tough here is the folks that are running elections are really good at the logistics and the process and procedures. We struggle a little bit communicating, but public outreach and communication for this election is absolutely king and critical. And so this is where conversations like this and some of the support from other media organizations has been invaluable in helping election administrators counteract that information and tell the true story.
And you brought up the new service. Oh, go ahead.
Let me add one thing. If you actually think a little bit about what would be required to commit a massive fraud at scale with mail-in ballots, you would have to collect and harvest thousands and thousands of ballots mailed to addresses all over the state. A handful of individuals couldn't possibly physically do that. And if you had a huge number of people trying to do that, it would be easily detected because conspiracies like that never wind up being really secret for long. So when you think about that, when you think about how difficult it would be to forge all those signatures, what you realize is that actually in many ways mail-in balloting is quite secure, and maybe more secure in some respects in the financial transactions we engage in either online or by mail, where we do occasionally see fraud. So, I mean, I do think, just calming people down and educating them is an important antidote to some of the hysteria which is being deliberately ginned up.
And I want to bring up the Postal Service, the U.S. Postal Service, because that is such a huge concern that many people are feeling here. And the head of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, he said about some of the changes that were happening regarding the Postal Service is the most blatant attempt to suppress voters in modern history. We have since seen a federal judge block some of those changes that were occurring at the Postal Service, but we still have this slowed down system over the last couple of months. So what is the state of the U.S. Postal Service? What is your take on whether or not people can depend and rely on getting their ballots through that system on time so that they count?
I'll take a start at that. Just to say that the data I've seen is that for local mailing, letters arriving 1 day late is happening 50% higher than normal. So that's 1 day later delivery than normal. That doesn't answer your bigger question, what's happening at the Postal Service, but maybe that gives a scale of what an impact might be of changes at the postal station, post office in terms of, what will actually happen on election day. I mean, I think, everyone goes, when they mail their Christmas packages, they go early. They don't go the day before Christmas. And voters are going to do likewise as regards getting their absentee ballots in. I mean, it's not, I guess I'm not trying to say it's not something we should disregard as a problem, but I'm optimistic that it's going to turn out not to have been as significant a problem as it's being played out to be. Maybe the panelists would have other views, though. I'd be interested to hear.
No, I mean, I mean, there are drop boxes too. I would observe, however, I think in general, there's been a slowdown in the mail, even apart from ballots, which may reflect management problems at the Postal Service.
Jennifer?
In Colorado, for years, we've encouraged voters to return that ballot if they're going to utilize U.S. Postal Service 3 to 5 days prior to the election. Otherwise, we've encouraged them to use a drop box. So this sort of fear about a delay in the ballot getting back isn't entirely new. But I think when we're thinking about both the time of delivery for that outbound packet to get to the voter, as well as return, this is why this message of having a plan and executing that plan early, meaning if you're going to vote a mail ballot, turning in that application early, returning it early, is really the best advice. I mean, we can argue all day about what is or isn't happening at the Postal Service. More importantly, I think we need to empower voters to start early.
How do people protect themselves from COVID-19? This is going to change everything.
I'll jump in real quick. Election officials across the country are implementing pretty impressive guidelines, actually. When we talk about in-person voting, there are a number of great guides out there from the CDC and others. We are seeing sanitation stations, social distancing, plexiglass barriers, limiting the number of people inside the location at any given time, disinfecting machines and equipment in between each user. So I think jurisdictions are taking that part very, very seriously. For staff that are processing mail within the election facility, the same, and that's part of that slowdown is now you've got to space everybody apart. You can't necessarily, jobs that normally are done in teams of 2 are done in teams of 2, 8 feet apart. So they're certainly responding to the health and safety of poll workers and voters and staff.
You all feel confident that that's true, that that's the case across the country? You would?
I think so, yeah.
In-person voting?
Yeah, I'm personally, I would say, I mean, I'm comfortable going to my grocery store these days and with a mask, and, I'm not going to feel any different when I go to my polling station on election day than I do going to that grocery store.
All right. I want to take a moment to bring in our audience questions, because we've given them an opportunity to go ahead and submit those questions. And so I want to start with a couple that Kara asked here. She says, I will be serving as a poll worker for the first time this year. I would like to have more information about what, quote, observational behaviors, unquote, are allowed and prohibited. Can people bring firearms? Can they loiter? Who'd like to take that one?
So it depends. Every state has different requirements for watchers. Every state has different requirements for open carry. So that's a tough question, but generally I would say they should not interfere with voting. So they can observe, but they can't interfere with the voting process.
And just to add to that, and Jennifer, you can help, substantiate this or elaborate on this, but the polling station officials have control and authority in the polling station. So they have the authority to remove a poll watcher who is not acting appropriately or is interfering with voters. I think the other thing to say, though, about poll watchers is, I've done a lot of election monitoring overseas, and poll watchers need to be understood as sort of a good thing in democracy. When we would go and observe other elections, if you notice poll watchers from both parties in the polling station, that was a sign that things were probably, on the up and up. Now, there's been a lot of sort of negative talk recently, but as long as they behave appropriately, they're increasing the transparency of the electoral process.
What do you think of this kind of the fear that some people have that some folks will be bullies, like they'll behave badly, that there's encouragement that people are, or even fear that people will be aggressive in their posture just because the country is so divided in this country, and this election is so divided?
I'll start and hope others can jump in. Voter intimidation is a felony, punishable by a year in prison and $1,000 fine. Now, of course, there's gray areas about what's disturbing, what's intimidating, what's annoying, and I'm sure there'll be lots of things along that spectrum that happen around polling stations. I think of Americans as being a courageous and robust people who like their rights, and I'm hopeful that people in line who hear, whatever the chant of one side or the chant of the other won't feel that chant means that they are intimidated from being able to vote their choice. I don't mean to make light of it. There definitely is a risk of problems around polling stations this year, but there are laws around intimidation, and we should count on our law enforcement to make sure those laws are enforced.
I mean, at some level, we need to tell people, and whether they draw inspiration from things in our history or they look around the world, that sometimes it does take courage to stand up and vote. We saw that in the South with African Americans, and we see it now, as I say, in Belarus and Hong Kong. So sometimes you have to reach within yourself and develop or find the fortitude to plow ahead and exercise your franchise.
I think it's important for poll workers and voters alike to understand that you can't just show up and be a poll watcher and observer. There's actually a process for that. You have to apply for that. You have to agree to abide by and understand the rules in your state and jurisdiction. And as Kevin mentioned, if you're unwilling to follow those rules, the poll worker, or if you're in a county facility watching absentee ballots, the election officials have the right to remove you. And so this isn't just about random citizens showing up to watch. They actually are not allowed to do that without following the protocols that are in place.
There's a follow-up question from Nina. It's similar, but I think it takes it to the next level. She says, what do you say to people who share that they are genuinely fearful of voting in person because of possible homegrown terrorist attacks, or those who are worried about rioting after the election?
I'll take this. I mean, I understand why people have a concern about that. And as I say, we've seen in some areas, we have, for example, militias, like what we had up in Michigan, attempting to intimidate people who are exercising their rights. We have to rely on, first of all, on state and local authorities to protect people who are showing up at the polls. And I will say, I think the FBI has been working with local authorities to identify groups that may be planning things so they can take action against them before the election. After the election is over, I think there is a legitimate concern that there may be some acting out and some violence. And it won't necessarily be everywhere, but it may be in some areas. And again, it's going to be on the local and state police authorities, supplemented by, for example, the FBI or similar groups, to identify who's carrying this out. And if they're actually committing acts of violence, those are obviously crimes. So it is going to be I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's going to be a very challenging environment in terms of people's behavior. But again, this is where I say, just as we didn't, hide in our beds after 9/11 because we were worried about terrorists coming to get us, we have to use that same courage in defending our democracy. Because look, here's what it boils down to, Suzanne. We are defending our democracy when we vote. When you don't vote, you're surrendering it. And we need to bear that in mind.
I'm sure that people are trying to also prepare for that reality. I mean, that is very, very much true. And we've heard a lot of people talk about making a plan to support each other, whether it's being ready to be out there all evening, all night, and to have that plan in place. I want to go to another question. Patrick wants to know, he says, I've heard that there was supposed to be more international election observers here this year, but now many of them are not coming. Is that concerning?
Maybe I'll start on that. I don't think so. I mean, I think it's interesting that question's been asked. It wouldn't have been asked in prior years. They've been coming for a decade or so and usually aren't given much attention. And maybe it's a sign of kind of how tense things are this year that people are focused on the international observers. I was on a call with a group of them a couple of days ago. They expect 130. They might have initially planned for twice that, but relative to the scale of operations of elections around the United States, 300 versus 130 is not really a relevant difference. That being said, it's an excellent team, very experienced, and they will be able to assess elements of our process and comment on elements of our process. I mean, for example, they can look at the safeguards in place around absentee balloting and be able to judge them in relation to best practices. And that doesn't take being in every polling station or every counting station to do that. So they've already done an excellent pre-election report. I think they will contribute to the debate significantly. The only thing they don't do is they don't do PR very well. So they're not going to really step forward. But I think this year, the media is going to be interested in hearing what they say, and will bring their conclusions into the public domain more so than prior years.
We have another question from John. He says, from your experience observing scores of elections under varying degrees of repression and interference, what efforts by random concerned citizens prior to the elections are likely to prove most helpful in supporting an outcome that appropriately reflects the will of the majority of the people in our country?
The actions of random individuals should be to vote and to encourage others to vote and to become aware and learn about the laws and have an informed opinion about the processes for election in your country or your state. That's how I would answer that, I guess. Anyone else have anything more they would say?
Yeah, there's been a really great effort this year to drive people to trusted sources of information, to your state officials' website, to your local officials' website. So I would say, sort of echoing what Kevin just said, drive people to the trusted sources of information. Try to counteract those myths or the misinformation that's happening to the best of your knowledge. I think that's the most powerful thing you can do right now, and encourage everybody, as we've said already, to have a plan and execute that plan early.
Our final question is really just along those lines. Your recommendations, the one message that you would have, the most important message perhaps, to voters in this extraordinary election. Michael.
Well, I think it's going to be in line with what we've talked about. If you're going to deal with a mail-in ballot, do it early, send it in early, read the instructions, and if you have to, for example, get a witness signature, do it in a safe way. If you have to put it in an internal envelope, a secrecy envelope, which is, I think, required in some states, do it that way. And take your time and treat it as a serious matter. If you're going to the polls, know where your drop boxes are if you're going to simply drop it off, or prepare yourself in terms of having a mask and maybe Purell or something, so that you can keep yourself safe while you wait online. It's really about planning and taking it seriously, and I think that's the best thing we can do.
Kevin.
I think we should take pride in our heritage that we are the first modern nation where a leader of the country stepped down because of the votes of the people, or where a challenger to the leader of that nation stepped down or realized he had not won, and his supporters realized he had not won, and where an incumbent realized he had not won and stepped down. That, it's almost our greatest invention. It's an innovation that other countries around the world have replicated, and it has brought peace and prosperity to places that have tremendous conflict. We should be proud of that heritage, and it leads us to accept the results however they come out.
Jennifer.
Recognize that your local election official, your state election official, all of the many millions of poll workers that are going to show up to help have all raised their hand and taken an oath to carry out that election and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state in which they serve. That's an important thing to remember. You need to trust them. They're doing a great job. They're doing everything they can to make this work. And we all need to recognize that this year might look a little bit different. I think we're all going to have a civics lesson as we go through the weeks and months after the election and understanding the different dates and deadlines and the way that the Constitution tells us this election will be carried out, and the way that the courts have determined in past years how this process should work. And so I think we need to trust that and try to, as much as we can, shut out some of that other noise and then vote.
Well put.
And Suzanne, I have a last thing I'd like people to consider. The social media platforms, which come in for a lot of criticism, have been taking steps in this election to take down things that are misleading in terms of instructions. And I think Facebook has now announced that after the election, they're going to cut out ads. I do think the mainstream media has a responsibility as well to set expectations, not to rush to get people to, click on something because you prematurely come out with a prediction, but really treat this as a test of the professionalism which I know responsible journalists have always exhibited.
Well put. Thank you so much to all of you. I appreciate it. Michael, Kevin, and Jennifer, to our panelists for a very informative, provocative, forward-looking conversation. Want to thank our audience, our viewers who are taking these insights with them, hopefully sharing with your family as well as your friends. Don't forget to make your voting plan. We are wishing you all a safe and secure election. Thank you for joining us. Avery?
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, panelists. That was a really interesting and informative conversation. Let me also offer my thanks to everyone in the audience. The last thing we want to do tonight is debut our new animated video about voting options. It runs about 90 seconds, and after you watch it, we hope that you'll go to cartercenter.org/vote to learn more and to share the video. Good night.
Look at them, getting ready to take part in history. Right now. From right there. Yep, and you can too, by voting this year. Now you're gonna want to buckle up for this one. You've heard of going to the polls on Election Day, casting your vote in person, the stickers. But if you're like her and want to be extra safe, you'll be glad to know you have other options. You just have to find the one that's right for you. Like voting in person before November 3rd. Early voting options can mean less crowds and shorter waits, and we all love that. Or voting by mail, sometimes called mail-in voting, other times called absentee voting. It's the same thing. They both mean requesting your ballot, getting it in the mail, and returning it as soon as possible. Well, all that's left is for you to make your own plan. I know. You're probably thinking, how is he so comfortable with this? Does it really work? Is it safe? Are we going to be okay? Well, Americans have been voting early and by mail since 1864. So we've had about 156 years to get it right. And each state is different, but they all take precautions to keep elections secure. Like tracking ballots to guarantee every vote is counted once and only once. So, my fellow Americans, let's get to the polls. Or get that mail-in ballot. Double check those directions and don't forget to sign it. It happens. No matter how you do it, your vote, your voice is important. Because making history takes us all.